The fluorescent lights of the police station burned my eyes as I sat in the cold metal chair, my hands trembling in my lap. I couldn't stop replaying the last 2 hours in my mind. One moment I was making dinner in our kitchen, and the next, my husband Marcus was on the phone with 911, his voice shaking with manufactured fear. "Please, you have to send someone. My wife just attacked me. I'm bleeding. I don't know what she's capable of." I had stood there, spatula still in my hand, frozen in disbelief as he clutched his face, blood seeping between his fingers. The thing was, I hadn't touched him. Not once. We'd been arguing about his late nights at the office, yes. My voice had been raised, absolutely. But assault? Never. Now, sitting across from Detective Morrison, a woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much, I tried to explain. My voice kept breaking. I didn't touch him. I swear on everything I love, I never laid a hand on my husband. Detective Morrison slid a folder across the table. Inside were photos of Marcus, his face bruised and swollen, a gash across his cheekbone that looked genuinely painful. My stomach turned. "Mrs. Chen, these injuries are quite severe," she said, her voice neutral but her gaze sharp. "Your husband claims you hit him with a cast iron pan during an argument." "That's insane," I whispered, staring at the photos. "The injuries were real, but they weren't from me." "Where is he now?" "St. Mary's Hospital, getting stitches." He insisted on pressing charges before going. Something about that detail snagged in my mind. Marcus had been hurt badly enough to need stitches, but he'd taken the time to come to the police station first? That wasn't the behavior of someone in pain or afraid. That was the behavior of someone executing a plan. To understand how I ended up in that interrogation room, you need to know about the marriage I thought I had. Marcus and I met 7 years ago at a charity gala. He was charming, successful, a hedge fund manager with an easy smile and the kind of confidence that made you feel safe. I was a pediatric nurse, working long shifts but loving every moment with my young patients. Our courtship was a whirlwind. Expensive dinners, weekend getaways, flowers delivered to the hospital. He proposed after 6 months, and I said yes without hesitation. My friends called it a fairy tale. The first 3 years were good. Not perfect, but good. We bought a house in the suburbs, talked about starting a family. But somewhere around year 4, Marcus changed. The late nights became more frequent. The business trips multiplied. When I asked questions, he called me paranoid. When I expressed concern, he called me clingy. "You're imagining things, Sarah," he'd say, his voice dripping with condescension. "You work too much. You're stressed. Maybe you should see someone." See someone. As in a therapist. As in, I was the problem. I started doubting myself. When I smelled unfamiliar perfume on his shirts, I wondered if my nose was playing tricks on me. When credit card statements showed charges at restaurants I'd never been to, I questioned my memory. Maybe he had mentioned those business dinners. Maybe I'd forgotten. The gaslighting was so subtle, so persistent, that I didn't recognize it for what it was until much later. He was rewriting reality, and I was letting him. But 6 weeks before the night of the assault, something changed. I stopped doubting. I started documenting. It started with a receipt. Marcus had left his jacket on the chair, and when I went to hang it up, a small piece of paper fell out. Dinner for 2 at Luminaire, the most expensive French restaurant in the city. The date was last Tuesday, when he told me he was in Boston for a conference. I'd checked his location on Find My Friends that night out of curiosity. It showed him at our home address. At the time, I'd assumed it was a glitch. Now I knew better. He'd left his phone at home. I started paying attention. Really paying attention. I noticed how he angled his laptop screen away when I entered his office. How he took calls in the garage. How he password protected his phone after years of leaving it unlocked. Then came the day I found the burner phone in his gym bag. My hands shook as I held the cheap flip phone, hidden at the bottom of his duffel bag beneath his workout clothes. I knew what this meant. You don't get a secret phone for innocent reasons. I opened it, expecting it to be locked, but it wasn't. The hubris of a man who never thought he'd be caught. The text messages loaded, and my world tilted on its axis. The messages were with someone named A. Hundreds of texts spanning months. The content ranged from explicit to mundane, painting a picture of a full-blown affair. dinner plans, hotel room numbers, I love yous. But what made my blood run cold were the most recent messages. She's getting suspicious, Marcus had written 3 days ago. What are you going to do? I responded, don't worry, I have a plan. By next week, she won't be a problem anymore. I took photos of everything. Every message, every contact, every call log. I uploaded them to a private cloud account Marcus didn't know about. Then I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. That night, Marcus came home late as usual. He kissed my forehead, asked about my day, microwaved leftovers. He was so normal, so casual, as if he hadn't just been planning to make me not a problem. I played along, smiled, asked about his day, told him about a difficult case at the hospital, all while my mind raced, trying to decode what he'd meant. Divorce? That would be the obvious answer. But the phrasing felt sinister. Won't be a problem anymore. 3 days later, I understood. 3 days later, he tried to have me arrested. Back in the interrogation room, Detective Morrison was watching me carefully. I realized I'd been silent for too long, lost in the memories. Mrs. Chen, I need you to walk me through the evening, step by step. I took a breath and began. I got home from my shift at 4. Marcus was already there, which was unusual. He's rarely home before 7. He said he'd left work early to talk. Talk about what? Our marriage. He said he felt like we'd been distant. He wanted to reconnect. The irony was bitter on my tongue. I was making dinner, pasta, his favorite. We were in the kitchen. I asked him where he'd really been the night he said he was in Boston. How did he react? He got angry, defensive, said I was being paranoid again, that I was trying to sabotage our marriage with my accusations. I met her eyes. I raised my voice. I admit that. I was frustrated, but I never touched him. He started yelling back, I continued. Then suddenly, he went quiet. He had this strange look on his face, almost calculating. He turned away from me, toward the counter where my cast iron skillet was sitting. And then, I paused, the memory crystallizing with horrific clarity. He picked up the skillet himself. Detective Morrison's eyebrow rose a fraction. Go on. He picked it up, and before I could process what was happening, he slammed it into his own face. The words came out in a rush. I screamed. I tried to grab it from him, but he did it again, hitting his cheekbone. There was blood everywhere. I was in shock, just standing there, and then he dropped the skillet and pulled out his phone. That's when he called 911? Yes. And he looked right at me while he did it. He looked at me, and he smiled. I could see the skepticism in Detective Morrison's face. Who would believe such a story? A man deliberately injuring himself to frame his wife? It sounded like a bad movie plot. Mrs. Chen, you're asking me to believe that your husband inflicted serious injuries on himself to frame you for assault. You understand how that sounds? I know how it sounds, I said, my voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill. But that's what happened. And if you check my medical records, you'll see I have no history of violence. Call my workplace. Talk to my colleagues. I'm a pediatric nurse. I've dedicated my life to helping people, especially children. Violence isn't in my nature. People can snap under the right circumstances. I didn't snap. My voice rose, and I forced myself to calm down. Please. There has to be a way to prove I'm telling the truth. Security cameras, something. Detective Morrison closed the folder. We'll investigate thoroughly. But right now, with the evidence we have, this doesn't look good for you. They let me go that night without charging me, but only because Detective Morrison said she wanted to review all the evidence first. I was instructed not to leave town and to stay away from Marcus. A restraining order would be filed in the morning. I sat in my car in the police station parking lot, my hands gripping the steering wheel, and I cried. Not just tears, but soul-deep sobs that shook my entire body. How had my life become this nightmare? When I finally composed myself, I made a decision. I drove to St. Mary's Hospital, the same hospital where I worked, though in a different wing. I needed to see Marcus. I needed to understand what was happening. I kept my head down as I walked through the familiar corridors, afraid of running into colleagues. The night shift supervisor, Linda, spotted me anyway. "Sarah? What are you doing here? You're not on until Thursday." "Personal matter," I said quickly. "Just visiting someone." She must have seen something in my face because she didn't press further, just squeezed my arm in wordless support. I found Marcus's room number from the emergency department registry, using my employee access. Room 347. As I approached, I heard voices inside. I stopped just outside the door, my heart pounding. "You're all set, Mr. Chen," a woman's voice said. "The stitches should heal nicely. Keep the wound clean and dry. Here's a prescription for pain medication and an antibiotic." "Thank you, nurse." Marcus's voice, and I could hear the charm in it even through the door. "Grace. Nurse Grace Patterson." "Thank you, Grace. You've been wonderful." I was about to leave, to come back later when I could speak to him alone, when I heard Grace say something that made me freeze. "Mr. Chen, I need to ask you something, and please understand I'm asking from a place of professional concern." "Of course," Marcus replied, his tone shifting, becoming wary. "These injuries. I've been a trauma nurse for 15 years. I've seen thousands of assault cases." She paused. "These injuries are consistent with self-infliction." The silence that followed was deafening. I pressed myself against the wall, barely breathing. "I don't know what you're implying," Marcus finally said, his voice cold. "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating a medical observation. The angle of the wounds, the force pattern, the location. When someone is struck by another person, there are defensive wounds, specific impact patterns. Your injuries don't match that. They match someone striking themselves." "That's absurd. My wife." "Your wife is Sarah Chen, isn't she?" Grace interrupted. "The pediatric nurse who works in the East Wing?" A pause. "Yes. I've worked with Sarah for 3 years. She's one of the kindest, most gentle people I've ever met. I've seen her calm violent patients, de-escalate dangerous situations, and I've never once seen her lose control." Grace's voice was firm. "So when you come in here claiming she did this to you, and the injuries don't match your story, I have questions." "You have no right to question me. I'm the victim here." "Are you?" "Because I called security and asked to see the footage from your home camera system. The one you mentioned to the intake nurse." My blood ran cold. "We had security cameras? Since when?" "You had no right," Marcus started, but Grace cut him off. "Actually, when domestic violence is suspected, we have every right to request evidence. It's hospital policy." And the security company was very cooperative once I explained the situation. "I want to speak to your supervisor." "This is harassment." "My supervisor is the one who suggested I request the footage, Mr. Chen." Grace's voice was calm, professional, but I could hear the steel underneath. "Would you like to revise your statement about what happened?" Another long silence. Then, "I want a lawyer." "That's your right. But I'll be sharing my medical assessment with the police, along with the security footage that clearly shows you striking yourself repeatedly with that skillet. I'll also be noting that your wife wasn't even in the room when the most severe injury occurred." I heard movement, footsteps approaching the door. I barely had time to duck into a supply closet before Grace emerged, a tablet in her hand and a grim expression on her face. She walked right past my hiding spot, heading toward the nurse's station. I waited 5 minutes before stepping out of the supply closet. My mind was reeling. Security footage. Grace had security footage that proved my innocence. But I needed to see Marcus. I needed to look him in the eye and hear him explain why he'd tried to destroy my life. I pushed open the door to his room. Marcus was sitting on the edge of the hospital bed, his head in his hands. When he heard me enter, he looked up, and for a moment, genuine fear flashed across his face. "Sarah, don't." I held up my hand. "Don't say my name like we're still married. Like you didn't just try to have me arrested for a crime you committed against yourself." He stood up, wincing at the movement. "You don't understand. Then make me understand, Marcus." I stepped closer, my voice shaking with rage. "Make me understand why the man I loved, the man I built a life with, would hurt himself just to hurt me." Make me understand that. Marcus's face crumbled. Not with remorse, but with something uglier. Resentment. You want to know why? Because you wouldn't let go. You kept digging, kept questioning. I needed you gone, and you wouldn't just leave. Gone? The word felt like ice in my mouth. What do you mean, gone? Divorced. Out of the picture. Away from me. He was pacing now, agitated. Amber and I want to be together. We're in love. But with you in the way, with your accusations and your suspicions, you were making everything complicated. Amber. That's A from the messages. It wasn't a question. So you thought framing me for assault was the solution? Having me arrested, potentially imprisoned. The prenup, he said, and suddenly things clicked into place. If you go to prison for assaulting me, the prenup is void. I get to keep everything. The house, the accounts, my reputation intact. You'd be the violent criminal, and I'd be the poor husband who suffered at your hands. The pure calculation of it stole my breath. Who are you? I whispered. The man I married would never. The man you married was whoever you wanted him to be, Marcus snapped. I played the part. Charming, devoted, perfect. But Amber sees the real me, and she loves who I actually am. A manipulative sociopath who hurts himself to frame his wife? Someone who takes control of his own destiny instead of being trapped in a dead-end marriage with a woman who thinks working as a nurse is some noble calling. The contempt in his voice was undisguised now. You make a fraction of what I make, Sarah. You're beneath me. You always were. I just needed your innocence, your goodness, for a while. It played well with my clients, my partners. The humble nurse wife. But I've outgrown that image. Every word was a knife. This was the man I'd shared a bed with, made a home with, planned a future with. And he'd seen me as nothing more than a prop in his life's performance. It doesn't matter, I said, finding my strength. Grace has the security footage. She knows what you did. Marcus smiled, and it was chilling. Does she? Because I never gave anyone permission to access my security system. That footage was obtained without consent. It's inadmissible. My heart sank. Was he right? Besides, he continued, I'll say the camera malfunctioned, showed the wrong timestamp. I'll say you set it up to create an alibi. I have the best lawyer's money can buy, Sarah. You have nothing. I have the truth. The truth? He laughed, bitter and cruel. The truth is what I make it. I've been building a case for months. I've told my friends, my colleagues, my family about your erratic behavior. Your jealousy. Your paranoia. I've created a narrative, and everyone believes it. Who's going to believe you? He was right. The realization was crushing. He'd been gaslighting not just me, but everyone in our social circle, laying the groundwork for this moment. I turned to leave, defeated, when Grace walked back into the room. She wasn't alone. Detective Morrison was with her, along with a uniformed officer. Mr. Chen, Detective Morrison said, I'm going to need you to come with us. Marcus's confident expression faltered. On what grounds? Filing a false police report. Attempting to pervert the course of justice. And after speaking with Nurse Patterson and reviewing the evidence she collected, potentially insurance fraud and perjury. Detective Morrison gestured to Grace. Would you like to tell him, or should I? Grace stepped forward, and I saw she was holding her tablet. The security footage I mentioned? I didn't access it through your security company. I accessed it through your wife's phone. Marcus went pale. What? 2 weeks ago, Sarah came to me concerned about her marriage. She mentioned you'd installed new security cameras, but wouldn't give her access to the feed. As her friend, I helped her install a monitoring app that would mirror the feed to her phone. Grace looked at me with something like pride. Sarah had access to everything the whole time. And it's all legal because the cameras are in her home too. But there's more, Grace continued. When I was treating you, I noticed some older bruising beneath the fresh wounds. Bruising that was several days old. That struck me as odd, so I documented it photographically, as a standard procedure for potential domestic violence cases. She turned the tablet to show Marcus. I couldn't see the screen from where I stood, but I watched the color drain completely from his face. Those photos show that you had pre-existing injuries, Detective Morrison explained. Injuries you inflicted on yourself in preparation, creating a pattern of abuse you could claim your wife was responsible for. You've been hitting yourself for days, building up to tonight's grand finale. That's not, I didn't, Marcus was stammering now, his composure completely shattered. We also have text messages between you and Amber discussing the plan, the detective continued. She was quite detailed in her responses about how to make it look convincing. She'll be charged as an accessory. Grace walked over to me, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I could breathe. She handed me the tablet, and I saw the photos. Dozens of them. Clear, clinical, indisputable evidence of Marcus's deception. Marcus Chin, you're under arrest for filing a false police report, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted obstruction of justice. The uniformed officer stepped forward with handcuffs. You have the right to remain silent. Marcus looked at me as they cuffed him, and the hatred in his eyes was so pure it was almost impressive. You did this. You manipulated everything. You're not the victim here. No, I said quietly. I'm the woman who documented everything because I knew, deep down, that you were capable of exactly this. I'm the woman who made friends with people who actually cared about justice. And I'm the woman who's going to walk out of here free while you face the consequences of your actions. As they led him away, he was still protesting, still claiming innocence, still trying to spin the narrative. But no one was listening anymore. Grace and Detective Morrison took me to a private consultation room. I was shaking, adrenaline and shock coursing through my system. Sarah, Grace said gently, sitting beside me. Why didn't you come to me sooner? If you'd told me what was happening. I wasn't sure what was happening, I admitted. I knew he was having an affair. I knew he was gaslighting me. But I never imagined he'd go this far. When you called me 2 weeks ago asking about the security cameras, I didn't make the connection. I thought you were just being helpful about a marital issue. When you mentioned he'd installed them but locked you out of the feed, I got suspicious, Grace explained. In my experience, when someone does that in a troubled marriage, they're either hiding something or planning something. I'm just glad I was able to help. Detective Morrison leaned forward. Mrs. Chen, we're going to need you to come to the station tomorrow to give a formal statement. But I want you to know, you're not in any trouble. The evidence clearly exonerates you. There's something else, Grace said, exchanging a look with the detective. When I was processing Marcus's medical records, I noticed he'd been to the ER 3 times in the past month. Different hospitals each time. Each visit, he had minor injuries he claimed came from accidents. Falls, walking into doors, that sort of thing. He was practicing, I whispered, horrified. Exactly. He was testing how much damage he could inflict on himself, learning what would be believable, what would require treatment. He was meticulous in his planning. Grace pulled up more files on her tablet. But here's what he didn't know. All ER visits in this state are logged in a centralized database for precisely this reason. To catch patterns of abuse, self-harm, or fraud. So even if tonight hadn't happened, even if his plan had worked, we would have caught him eventually, Detective Morrison confirmed. The medical system would have flagged the pattern. But it might have been too late for you. You might have already been convicted. The thought made me nauseous. I'd come so close to losing everything. The next few weeks were a blur. Marcus was denied bail due to flight risk and the severity of the charges. Amber was arrested at her downtown apartment, and the text messages between them became public record. The media had a field day with the story. Wealthy hedge fund manager frames wife for assault in elaborate insurance fraud scheme. I took a leave of absence from work. Not because I couldn't handle the job, but because I needed time to process what had happened. To mourn the marriage I thought I'd had. To grieve the person I believed Marcus to be. Grace checked on me daily. My colleagues from the hospital sent cards and flowers. My parents flew in from California and stayed for 2 weeks, helping me sort through the wreckage of my life. I filed for divorce, and with the evidence of Marcus's crimes, the prenup was indeed void. I would keep the house, half of everything, and my dignity. But more than anything, I needed to heal. Not just from Marcus's betrayal, but from the months of gaslighting, the constant self-doubt, the erosion of my confidence. He'd made me question my own reality, and rebuilding that trust in myself would take time. 6 months later, I sat in a courtroom as Marcus's sentence was read. 5 years for fraud, false reporting, and conspiracy. Amber received 3 years as an accessory. They would not be eligible for early parole. Marcus looked smaller in his prison jumpsuit, diminished without his expensive suits and practiced charm. When the judge asked if he had anything to say, he stood and looked directly at me. "I'm sorry, Sarah." But his eyes were empty. He wasn't sorry for what he'd done. He was sorry he'd been caught. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. I'd already said everything that mattered in my victim impact statement, describing the psychological torture of the gaslighting, the terror of nearly being convicted of a crime I didn't commit, the betrayal of discovering the man I loved had seen me as nothing more than an obstacle to remove. Outside the courthouse, Grace was waiting for me. We'd become close friends through all of this, bonded by the shared experience of bringing the truth to light. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Free," I said, and meant it. For the first time in years, I feel free. We walked to a nearby cafe, and over coffee, I told her about my plans. I was going back to work next week. I was considering going back to school for a nurse practitioner degree. I was going to therapy weekly. I was rebuilding my life, piece by piece, into something authentic and mine. "You know what the strangest part is?" I said. "I don't hate him. I don't wish him more suffering than what he's already facing. I just feel nothing. He's a stranger to me now. The man I loved never really existed." Grace reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You survived something most people can't even imagine. And you came out stronger. That's what matters." She was right. I had survived. And more than that, I had won. Not because Marcus was in prison, but because I'd refused to let his lies become my reality. I documented the truth, trusted my instincts, and built a support system that believed in me. As I walked home that evening, past the park where Marcus and I used to jog on Sunday mornings, past the restaurant where he'd proposed, past all the ghost memories of a life that had never been real, I felt something unexpected. Hope. My future was uncertain, but it was mine. No more manipulation. No more gaslighting. No more performing for someone who saw me as less than human. I was Sarah Chen, pediatric nurse, survivor, and finally, gloriously, free. And that was the sweetest revenge of all.